Make sure it's still okay.
All right, it looks like we are alive and well.
Right.
Let me double check here.
Right. It looks like we are alive and well.
Right.
Let me
Double check.
put this on.
It's your evil self.
Doppelganger.
Yeah, when you put it on live, that's what happens. Something shoots up, and if I don't put it on mute, I get hit. So awesome. Well, Mitch, it's awesome to have you here. Welcome everybody, and welcome, Mitch.
Glad to be here, man. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Great to hear you. Thanks for being here for this Aeon Byte live as we try to transition into the world of video and make it more interactive and everybody can have a good time and all that stuff. So so awesome. And we've got ourselves to keep us company. We got Nate, aka Occult Fan. How you doing?
Hey everyone. Hey Mitch, and hey Miguel. Hi everyone.
Good evening, everyone. So awesome. Let me double check here. We got people. Yeah, we got people lining into the comment section. So hopefully we'll have some great questions for you. Really enjoyed your book, Mitch, and
Thank you. Appreciate it.
A great read. So what I wanted to start with is this is actually a very personal book. I was actually surprised. I mean, you pretty much laid it on the line. And
Yeah.
I've met you. I've read a lot. I read your blog posts, follow you on Twitter, but you decided to go personal. Is this one of those things you said, well, if I'm going to talk the talk, I better show the world that this works, that my philosophy and what I'm doing is working?
Exactly. I really made a decision to be very blunt and very personal in this book because I am writing about intimate issues in people's lives, and I am maintaining that mind causation is a philosophy of practical results, that it can be used in matters of commerce and relationships and career and self-image and difficulties and issues that you have in your past and in your present. And I feel very strongly that I need to be self-disclosing in such a situation, and wherever possible need to be verifiably self-disclosing. There can be no playing games with the reader and just quoting anonymous people or telling stories that got emailed to me here or there. Everywhere I possibly can, I give names, dates, locations, including things that have occurred, deeply, deeply personal things that have occurred in my own life. For example, for the first time anywhere, I read about my own hospitalization for anxiety when I was 12 years old. And I could never previously find language to write about that. In fact, for years, I was crushingly embarrassed about it. I felt like making the admission that I was on an adolescent psychiatric ward at age 12 was something that for many years either hid or I just didn't talk about. But I really feel strongly that if I'm asking for people's attention in this book or in talks that serve as some sort of an adjunct to the book or interviews like this one, I have to be very forthright. I have to be very personal because I'm asking them to invest their own personal lives and their own intimate energies in the mind causation philosophies that I write about in the book. So I appreciate you recognizing that. It's far and away the most personal thing I've ever written.
Yeah, it's great to get to know, again, the intimate Mitch, putting it all down the line. And I have to admit, and you address this in your book, but when I first met you at the Gnostic conference, I'm like, oh dear, Horowitz from New York. We've got some white privilege here. What is he going to tell me about the hardships of life? But the truth is, you had a pretty humble, I don't know, beginning, but you had a humble life.
Yeah, it's funny, and you're right, and I address this in the book. People figure, right, your name is, Horowitz, and you grew up in New York City, dad must be a lawyer for Coca-Cola or something, and you're coming from cushy circumstances. And that's a reasonable assumption. But in my case, it was wrong. And of course, we never know really what's going on in someone's life behind the curtain. People's lives are always more complex than one might assume. And we grew up in just financially disastrous circumstances, which I write about in the book. None of which isn't to say that I didn't benefit from white privilege. I like to remind people, including people I'm related to, that yes, it may have sucked, and yes, it may have been terrible, but it was a hell of a lot better in some circumstances. We always had food to eat, we always had clothes on our back, and we weren't being looked at suspiciously by the police. So there were in fact intrinsic advantages that we carried with us. But growing up was tough. We hid poverty behind kind of a very thin pattern of middle-class life. We wore used clothes, heated a house that we couldn't afford with kerosene heaters, drove around in a Volkswagen Beetle with a hole in the floor, and had no gifts on Christmas or birthdays and so on. And it was just, that's just the way it was.
And you and your sister had to buy your own Christmas gifts and then put them on the tree and pretend that Santa gave you. That was heartbreaking.
That's what we would do. There were unhappy times. But a lot better than what people suffer, all around this world and all around our country. But I did feel I had to be disclosing about that again for probably one of the first times ever, because I just wanted people to understand that I really can relate to people in need. We grew up in need, and I've never forgotten it. And I care very, very deeply about the experiences of working people. I care very deeply about the experiences of people who are hassled by our system, because I come from a situation where we were working people in desperate, dire economic straits, and we didn't know which way to turn.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Oh, and for the audience, of course, I should have mentioned, yes, this is YouTube Live, but the audio version will be out on iTunes and everything later on this week. So those of you who might be missing, don't worry, but I guess you're not here to tell me that you might be missing it. And so Mitch, going back to your fascinating life, when did you become interested in the occult? Were your parents, were they more secular, or when did your interest begin?
Well, my interest began very early. I would take books of folklore out of our local public library, and I was interested in astrology and folklore and mythology. And my sister brought home the books of Carlos Castaneda from the school library, and I was turned on very, very early by all things occult and esoteric. But I also saw them very early as philosophies and tools that you could use to navigate through life. And I think that's always remained something that I've been very, very attached to. I'm really deeply interested in practical philosophies. And as I get older, that commitment only increases. And one of the things I write about in this book is my deep-seated validation of people's sense of aspiration, what they want in life, where they're going in life. I believe there are too many philosophies that would seek to divert people or tell them that they're asking the wrong question or try to turn them in this way or that way. And quite frankly, I have to be honest, and I know this rubs some people the wrong way, but I'm not an admirer at the end of the day of the ideas promulgated by authors like Eckhart Tolle or Michael Singer. I recognize that people have received wonderful and significant things from their teachings, and I applaud that. But those paths are not my path. Mine is not a path of non-attachment. I do believe in the spiritual very deeply, insofar as I believe in an unseen principle of life, but I actually don't feel that non-attachment or non-identification is a valid path for a Western seeker. I don't think that at the end of the day, the Western seeker is going to be happy, is going to feel satisfied with his or her existence, unless they also feel that their path has involved some very active progression in the direction of a productive, generative goal, one that can be expressed very simply and clearly in this outward world that we live in, that we belong to, as well as the inner world that I think is interconnected to the outer in such a way that I don't even like to think of them as two sides of the same whole. I don't even see any dichotomy. I really feel very strongly at this point in my search that the inner and outer are part of one continuous whole, and that outer attainment, achievement, progress is a profoundly and deeply vital and necessary thing for the creative individual.
Yeah, it reminds me of what they talk about spiritual bypassing. We get a little spiritual and we immediately want to go to the cave and meditate or go to the jungle and be alone. But and that's something that happens. But the reality is we live in what I call a more Jungian reality. The goal is not to transcend to the spiritual world, but the battle is here on this earth. It's individuation. It's becoming
Yes.
whole human beings and reaching our potential. And
That's
you talk about this in your book. I mean, people misrepresent the Hermetics and the Gnostics, but they were never about escaping the earth. They were about an alchemical transformation while here on the earth, while in society, while becoming the most useful members for their society, helping others. And yes, you want to break away from the wheel of karma. Ultimately, that's a goal, but the battle is here, like say, individuation. That's what you're advocating.
Yes, I feel very strongly about that. And I honor that. And I think it's necessary both for people who regard themselves as spiritual or those who see life in a more secular or humanistic way. I believe that if we take seriously the dictum, the principle as above, so below, which is expressed in Western scripture in the terms of God creating man in his own image, I think that's just an iteration of that same principle, then it stands to reason that we are here to create. We are here to be generative. We are here to be productive. We are here within our own concentric circle of reality to function as creators. Mm-hmm. So I care very, very deeply in my own life and the lives of other people about seeing that people feel the capacity to create, to complete, to progress in the directions that they have designs on. And one of the things I write about in the book is that in many regards, I think a lot of what we refer to today as pathology or neurosis in the otherwise highly functioning individual is a frustrated sense of this power, is a frustrated sense of this creative potential. Obviously, some people are suffering from very deep-seated emotional disorders and they need a complexity of care. But for some of us, who go and bend our shrink's ear for 45 minutes or an hour once a week, which is most of us, and I'm not down on that, I do that too. But I think that a lot of what we talk about in those settings and in those situations is ultimately an expression of the frustration that we're feeling to move in the direction of attainment, of actualization of our plans in the world, whatever they are. For some people, that might be commerce. For other people, that might be art. For other people, that might be martial arts. For somebody else, it's soldiering. For somebody else, it's teaching. Whatever it is, I think that anything that stymies our capacity to function and move in that direction is where these frustrations come from. And that once one does move in those directions, the things that we think were so important, like childhood traumas or some sort of deep-seated conflicts that we felt from the past, they recede. I can speak to that from my own experience. Believe me, I have, as many shitty days as anybody else, but ever since I have come to feel that my aim in life is to be generative, to be productive, since my path has been one of unapologetic attainment, I have felt much more relaxed. I have felt much more whole. I have felt much less attached to what can often feel like the fruitless search for motive that we find within therapy. And I'm not down on therapy. I participate in it myself. But I feel very strongly that our minds do contain extra-physical causative abilities and agencies, and that we are only half living in a certain sense if we're not using those, if we're not experimenting with those.
Yeah, well said. And I want to I have questions written, but I want to let the chat room sort of dictate where we're going as we're talking. First, somebody said, Nate, you look like Dracula there in the dark. So I thought, yeah, there you go. So yeah. But some people are already going, oh my God, what about an evil God? God is evil, blah, and so forth. So might as well go with this question because
Please.
your book, The Miracle Club, deals with the problems with New Thought and New Age, also the solutions, where it should go. I mean, you cover all the bases. So why don't we talk with some of the issues with New Thought, and one of them would be theodicy, or the reason for the nature of suffering. What's the problem with New Thought, and what do you think are the solutions?
New Thought has never really come up with a theology of suffering, and that is its big Achilles heel, because we are going to experience in some equal measure joys and tragedies in this life. We are physically fragile. These bodies that we occupy are going to decline. We are going to experience mortality. We live under multiple laws and forces, or at least in our 5 sensory existence, which we occupy the vast majority of waking time, we are compelled to experience multiple laws and forces. Whatever the ultimate nature of our existence, the cosmic or the physical framework in which we live conscripts us to experience decline. Mortality alone tells us that. And I don't feel that New Thought has come up with a persuasive theology for people who are suffering from illnesses that will prove terminal, that are suffering from chronic pain, that are suffering from grievous despair, who have experienced just body blows of suffering. And that is profoundly concerning to me, because I do believe deeply in the central principle of New Thought, which is that thoughts are causative. And I consider myself a part of the New Thought community. New Thought, in many regards, is my primary commitment, if I were to put a name on it. And yet, New Thought has not been successful at reaching people in the deepest depths of need, including chronic need or chronic suffering, as it has been at devising a very, very good and effective popular literature. For everything that New Thought has done to produce a popular literature, which I applaud, there are a lot of truths in that popular literature. It hasn't found a mature tone to address people who have been victims of tremendous tragedies. And I try in my own way to begin doing that in the Miracle Club, because I do believe it has a message for such people. And if it doesn't have a message for such people, then we're dealing with ideas that certainly cannot be called lawful, because they're not universally applicable. And I do believe that New Thought is going to have to start facing these things, especially as we are living longer and end-of-life issues come into the picture more and more in our lives today in the way that they didn't maybe 2 generations ago. I mean, 2 generations ago, if you had a certain form of cancer, or if you had a certain form of dementia, you were going to die. Today, people experience years of life with conditions that otherwise might have been terminal. And if those years of life are ones of discomfort, for example, New Thought has to be able to address that. And so I try to deal with that as best I can in the book.
Yeah, I mean, you yourself, somebody brought it in the chat room. I will try to get all your questions, so keep asking. Can't promise, but you yourself write, and somebody again wrote in the chat room, one of the problems with New Thought is the idea of victim shaming. It's my karma, I deserved it. I'm sure, does that infuriate you, Mitch?
Yes, and you know, it's interesting. You will hear in a subtle way, and there are some of my friends in the New Thought world who hate when I say this, but I do feel it's true. There is a certain degree of victim shaming, even if it's sometimes very subtle or very gentle, or even if, you know, the fist is cloaked with a silk glove. You know, the historic response to people who are suffering and say, gee, I've been doing my prayers, I've been doing my affirmations, I've been doing my visualization, and things are still horrible. is to basically suggest, however compassionately, that they're not doing it right. Go back and do this, go back and do that. Whereas it may be that they are experiencing forces in life that are as present and as inevitable as the forces of mind. And I feel strongly that we in the New Thought world should be very, very careful not to make offhanded references to karma, because when karma is a very big issue, and it's one that a person has to fall to his knees in front of. I mean, we just don't have the perspective to understand the karmic wheel. I think every religion, every culture, every individual instinctively, and I believe rightly, feels that there is some kind of reciprocity, but it can be on such a vast scale that it's very, very hard to just trot out and say, well, it must be Mitch's karma. It's very, very hard to say that, especially since we don't have the perspective on what's going to happen in 15 minutes. What seems to me to be a burden could become the thing that saves my life. I remember one of the meanest people I ever met at one time told me, you should always carry a mini flashlight with you. And I thought, that person is probably going to save my life someday. I'll carry that mini flashlight and it will save my life. So we lack, I do think that at certain exquisitely sensitive moments, we experience perspective, but those are exceptional moments. And perhaps our discussion of karma can only occur at such exceptional moments. It's not something to talk about lightly, and I think too frequently it will sometimes be used as an escape hatch to explain why the methods aren't working. Well, it must be karma. And one doesn't know that. And if you defer everything to karma, then you begin to, in a certain sense, argue for the randomness of life. Since I can't possibly control some sort of karmic debt that I have from some other period of time, I can live with it, but it feels like almost an admission of randomness, which I'm not really down with either. I do think we have shades of perspective, shades of agency, powers and forces in our lives that we very often neglect. I also think we're at the mercy of powers and forces that are quite enormous. Just because we have a non-physical existence, and I believe strongly that we do, doesn't mean that we also don't suffer the experience of tremendous limits within our framework. So I do think we have to really be careful of backdoor victim blaming, and I do think we have to be really careful of a too colloquial use of concepts like karma.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And the other thing I would say too, and then we can break down more of the issues with New Thought, but let me tell you a story. A few days ago, I was at an AA meeting, and it was at a Lutheran church that I go to here.
By the way, I want to point out this is a non-alcoholic beer. I'm not, drinking in front of you as if to rub your nose in it. People are saying in the comments board, Horowitz is drinking. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
That is a non-alcoholic beer. I am sober.
There you go. Well, congratulations for being sober today, man. So I was at a meeting, and again, the priest there, the head priest, is actually a member, and everybody's talking, and everybody's talking about my higher power. I'm surprised I haven't been kicked out yet because of my higher power. And I looked at him. Okay, what we believe in a higher power, why not believe in a lower power?
Yes.
They're like, well, it's my ego. Oh, well, then your higher power has to be your ego. You can't, it just makes sense. So do you think there's room in New Thought for ontological evil, or do you think it's not even there yet? I mean, like Gordon White once said at Rune Soup, 95% of cultures have a belief in evil spirits or evil God. We've just, in fact, the Western Hermetic system is slowly sort of taken evil out of the equation. I mean,
I agree.
For the most part.
That's a wonderful issue you've raised, and there's so much to unpack in that. First of all, I think our perception of what is and isn't evil is sometimes hampered by a great deal of tunnel vision, by a great deal of narrowness. My reading of Genesis 3 has Eve and the serpent as the heroes of Genesis 3, in the sense that Adam and Eve were kept like poodles in this garden of paradise where a deity, we know not who, told them, you can partake of every fruit and everything you want in the garden except that tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, why is it there to begin with? What's the purpose of putting a tree there that's going to give you discernment, the capacity for measurement, the capacity for creative expression, but you're told cruelly that you can't eat from it. And so I think that the serpent and Eve are the heroes of Genesis 3. And of course, with that claiming of one's birthright of creativity comes friction. So we're told Eve suffers pain in childbirth. We watch their children, Cain and Abel, commit an act of fratricide. And I think that it may be that friction is the price that we pay for creativity. Friction is the price that we pay for a sense of self-agency. So what is and isn't evil is something that, again, in the same way that I think we have to be careful not to approach concepts of karma in too conversational, too glib a way, all the more so for evil. And I sometimes wonder if a phrase like higher power, I mean, I love Bill Wilson, and I think Bill opened up so much by offering people that phrase. But if Bill were alive today, and Bill wasn't afraid of anything, there was no spiritual idea that Bill wouldn't be willing to look at and examine and experiment with. If Bill was alive today, I would love to talk to him about whether the phrase higher power unintentionally reinforces this kind of above, below, binary, tunnel vision view of the human situation. Because I think people could find inspiration and power from all kinds of sources that are not sufficiently described as evil. So I find myself more and more saying less that I want to relate to a higher power and more that I want to relate to greater forces. I find myself thinking of it in that way, extra-physical forces.
Mm-hmm. No, makes sense. Yeah. Well, as long as we are evolving. So Nate, guys, I'm going to check out if you have any questions. I believe Oswald Spengler, if you have another question, I'll try to get to you. Nate, do you have a question for Mitch while I look at the good people in the chat room?
Yeah, sure. Mitch, I have a whole couple of pages of things I wrote down. So since we're only going to be able to get to a few tonight, I'd like to read one of your quotes to you and see what you have to say with regards to that.
Sure.
Is that all right with you?
Please, yeah.
All right. So his dedication to the ethic of cooperative advancement above competition and his belief that competition itself is an outmoded idea is due to be supplanted once humanity discovers the ever-renewing creative capacities of the mind. Maybe you could talk to that.
Sure.
That's from page 101.
That's either a quote from or my paraphrasing of Wallace D. Wattles, the author of The Science of Getting Rich. And Wattles was basically a Marxist. And you wouldn't necessarily think that The Science of Getting Rich would have a Marxist author. It sounds rather contradictory. But the fact is, he believed in a kind of spiritual anarchy. He believed that we were exiting a phase of life where we needed to depend upon these titans of industry to organize commerce for us. That, in true Marxist fashion, Wattles believed that they were necessary. They served a necessary function to industrialize and create a commercial network in the world. We're part of the world, but their day had passed. And with their passing would come a new man, a new individual who was possessed of an understanding and some degree of control over the creative capacities of his mind. And when such a day dawned, when such an individual entered maturity, we wouldn't need the Rockefellers and the railroad barons any longer. And we wouldn't need this kind of dog-eat-dog competition, but there would be a kind of anarchistic utopia where every individual would be able to tend his own garden and cooperate with his neighbors and so on. Wildly idealistic point of view, but also very beautiful. And what an original voice he was. This was a Marxist metaphysical writer from the early 20th century, and lots of people today in our early 21st century love Wallace D. Wattles, and I love Wallace D. Wattles. But a great many people will miss the Marxist language in his books, and will miss the fact that he himself was also a political activist. He ran for Congress on the Socialist Party ticket. He ran for mayor of Elwood, Indiana, came in a close second on the Socialist Party ticket. His daughter Florence was a Socialist Party organizer. He was planning another run on the Socialist ticket, but he died of tuberculosis. So, he was just absolutely unclassifiable. And if you read The Science of Getting Rich with a New Set of Eyes, it becomes almost like this Marxist prosperity gospel. It's absolutely wild.
That's an interesting answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Mitch, continuing asking more about the New Thought movement, and sort of maybe a two-part question, but it really gets to the crux of your book. You talk about New Thought is divided into those who want to be activists and those who just want personal benefit.
Yeah.
Same time, your book deals with the two questions which are important. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar, and on the other hand, Jesus saying, you cannot serve two masters, either serve me or Mammon. So so basically the question with all of this thing I'm throwing at you is, why should we want to have material wealth instead of spirituality? Or is that, I just gave you a loaded question? It's neither or, right?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I have contradictions within myself about this. I mean, look, I often say to people that if it wasn't for my mother's labor union, which was the 1199 hospital workers, I wouldn't have a tooth in my mouth. I mean, I had lost my lower teeth in an accident when I was a kid, and we wouldn't have had any health insurance, any dental coverage if it wasn't for that union. So I'm a socialist of the heart, and I really believe strongly in organized labor. I believe very, very deeply in the rights of working people. At the same time, for all that, I don't like the social justice emphasis within New Thought. I think it's very mushy. I think it's very poorly defined. I think it truncates the whole subject, because when you use a term like social justice, you're almost excluding large numbers of people who have their own conception of social justice, or who believe that social justice is actually something that leads us into a ditch of a collectivized mush. And you have people who believe that much greater justice comes from allowing the individual to strike out, and, according to his or her own designs, and not be burdened by people who are going to provide them with some sort of a collective definition of what the good society or the good life looks like. So I don't think, personally, I prefer the Think and Grow Rich approach in New Thought. I prefer the New Thought that extols and supports the agencies of the individual. And then the individual can go and use that in whatever way he or she wants. And can use that in very powerful ways. And I think New Thought should strengthen the ability of the individual to see through his or her own sense of personal agency in the world. And at that point, I turn the steering wheel over to the individual. I don't think New Thought functions well as a movement that kind of projects a group answer onto people. Even in the case of Wallace D. Wattles, here I am referring to him as a Marxist, and that's all true, and that's all defensible within his work. But he ultimately saw the individual man or woman tending his or her own garden in this kind of anarchist splendor as the epitome of creativity, of personal expression. And I continue to feel that way, and that's why I am interested in New Thought. So I favor that part of New Thought far and away above the attempts to turn it into a social justice movement.
Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you very pointedly say New Thought has not matured since 1910.
Yeah.
That's throwing the gauntlet on the floor to your colleagues and your community. I mean, that's
yes, absolutely.
Good. I mean, all religions have sort of matured. Why?
I think New Thought has been hampered by a childishness of language, a childishness of tone, an insistence upon a kind of one-size-fits-all law of attraction. The attachment to this idea of one mental super law, I think, fails to cover the bases of life. If you really believe that, it puts you in front of a very deeply radical metaphysic. And there are New Thought writers who do believe that life itself is subject only to one force, and that is consciousness or awareness. I mean, that's true of my hero Neville Goddard, who I have tattooed on my arm here. And I experiment with that kind of radical self-expression, that kind of radical self-responsibility, extremist self-responsibility. And I love it. At the same time, I do think it doesn't cover the complexities of life that we face as a day-to-day reality in a world in which our mortality is insured. There may be truth to the fact that that mortality is an illusion that we linear-minded five sensory beings are forced to endure, and that there is a greater perspective that will free us from that. And granted, but I have to deal with what's happening next Tuesday. I have to deal with next Tuesday because I have embraced a path of practicality. And I don't think that New Thought has met that challenge. I don't think it's met that challenge in its exploration of complexity. I don't think it's met that challenge in its response to suffering. I don't think it's met that challenge in a maturity of language. And I don't think it's met that challenge in its intellectual culture. I am concerned and I am confused as to why New Thought has not produced more of its own intellectuals. There are great intellectuals who have emerged from Christian Science, a movement with a truly radical metaphysic. There are great intellectuals who have emerged from Mormonism. There are great intellectuals who have emerged from a whole range of different movements, new and old. Wicca, neo-paganism, Satanism, all kinds of movements have produced really formidable intellects. I have not seen very many formidable intellects come out of New Thought, even though that's my home, that's my neighborhood, that's the place I love. And I'm concerned by that. I'm concerned that New Thought has been so successful at promulgating a popular literature. And as I mentioned, very often a really good literature. I believe there's truth in a lot of those popular books, including The Secret. But it has not matured in language. It hasn't been troubled enough by its own contradictions, and it hasn't challenged itself enough. And the reason I chose the year 1910 is because that year marked the death of William James and Mary Baker Eddy. And I think that James, towards the end of his life, was really experimenting with mind metaphysics in all of its vast different forms, and that his loss was never really replaced. His protege, Horatio Dresser, was a New Thought thinker, a very fine intellect. But even Horatio didn't fully occupy or step into those shoes. And I don't think that after James's death, the movement underwent much maturation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. Here, if you don't mind asking a side question, and let me know if you know the answer. That's from Oswald Spengler. He's asking from the chat room, does Mitch know what drew the New Thought movement and the Yogi Publication Society to Chicago, especially in the 1900s when the Kybalion was published?
That's a great question. Chicago had quite an active metaphysical scene in the early 20th century. One of the reasons for that is that the great Emma Curtis Hopkins, who had been a student of Mary Baker Eddy and went on to become a really vital teacher in the early New Thought movement, she was based in Chicago for a time. And there were other people who branched off from Eddy's world who were based in Chicago. And thanks to their influence, Chicago really was host to a major metaphysical scene in the early 20th century. And if you were into Christian Science or New Thought or one of the various offshoots,
Theosophy,
great place to be. Yeah. And so you have a guy like William Walker Atkinson, who founded the Yogi Publication Society, so energetic, so brilliant, so just bounding with life and ideas. And he was interested in everything. He was interested in theosophy. He was interested in Vedic philosophy. He was interested in Hermeticism. He was interested in New Thought. And so his Yogi Publication Society became this wonderful kind of multi-spoke wheel for all those different outlooks.
Wonderful. Thanks for answering. What say you, Nate, or Count Dracula over there in the dark?
This is why we're doing this at night.
I promise I won't come for your blood for that one, Miguel. But can you trust a vampire, as promised?
And promise. That'll be the subject of your next show.
I'm writing a book about Tool, and one of the tracks on there is called Ticks and Leeches. But yeah. So there's a whole bunch of quotes here, but I guess I'm just going to throw out the playbook and just go with one from the heart. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the importance of. I also practice transcendental meditation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about the virtues of that, and maybe give people why that's a helpful tool, because I can, from my own experience, say that it's helped me a lot. So maybe talk a bit about, why that's such a useful thing, why people like David Lynch think it's so useful and even teach it in schools for kids.
Yeah.
A little bit about TM, maybe, Mitch.
Sure. It's a mantra-based form of meditation where you receive a mantra, which in effect is a meaningless sound, and you repeat it internally, silently, and it brings you quickly and almost infallibly into a state of very, very deep relaxation. And when you're in that state, you experience physical benefits, you experience mental benefits, you experience emotional benefits. It also seems to me that it's a state from which your visualizations, your mental pictures are kind of almost operating at a kind of prime time capacity, similar to the state of hypnagogia, which I write about in the book, which is this exquisitely relaxed state which you experience just before you drift asleep at night, and again, just as you're coming to wakefulness in the morning. And it seems to me that when the body and the psyche is exquisitely relaxed, which is something that's experienced in the state of transcendence that this mantra-based meditation offers, it serves, among other things, to filter out all the background noise that is so depleting and so distracting, even when we're in a state of ordinary quiet. It's very, very helpful in getting rid of all that noise. And even if your thoughts are still moving and you're still experiencing mental associations and so on, which is almost always the case, you're experiencing them in a way that is non-threatening, in a way that doesn't feel forced upon you by some outside influences. And I do think that it becomes prime time, in a sense, for the causative powers of your psyche to experience a heightening, because it's a period of focused relaxation that's almost like none other. So that's been my experience.
Right on. Thanks. I'd have to say I concur.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Good. Somebody's writing that they've had 10,000 orgasms. That's great.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I guess people are enjoying themselves in the chat room. But that's one way to do it. Right. So your book, the crux of your book would have to be our thoughts can shape our reality. And you mentioned The Secret, which has been vilified.
We all hate it. Right.
So tell us about this thesis. How can our thoughts shape reality?
Yeah. Well, first a quick word about The Secret. I've written critically about The Secret. I've been critical of Rhonda Byrne. I've written critically about her in my book, One Simple Idea. And there are things that she and I disagree on very fundamentally and very deeply. But at the same time, I got fed up with this kind of backlash against The Secret, because the truth is the movie does profess some very good values. I've watched it with one of my kids. I think it has gotten a whole generation of people thinking about different possibilities, different ways they can use their mind. And I really do believe in my heart that most of the people who criticize it or who hate on it have never seen it, have never read it. And haven't we just had enough of that at this point? And I'm tired of, hearing from people who have just read the coverage of something. And I can always tell when somebody hasn't read The Secret or when they haven't read Think and Grow Rich, in the same way that any 7th grade English teacher can tell which kid hasn't read Lord of the Flies. You just know, they speak in these generalities. Spare me. I can tell immediately. So that's why I defend The Secret nowadays. Now, as far as, why should any of this be happening at all? I mean, if people like me are correct, why is anything going on at all? And I'm really compressing, a whole universe of speculation into about the size of a marble right now, but I'll ask your indulgence and tolerance. I don't speak or think in terms of manifesting. I speak and think in terms of selecting. And I do believe that it's quite possible, as we've seen across a very, very broad field of studies and in various strains of mystical philosophy, that we exist within an infinitude of occurrences that are going on at once. And the linearity that we call time or that we call reality is a very necessary, very vital illusion that we experience as 5 sensory beings so that we can navigate through this world, cosmos, however you want to put it, of superposition or infinitude in which we live. And I don't see any reason why our 5 senses are ultimately any different from a measuring device or a kind of biologic measuring device, much like measuring devices that are being used right now, like this camera that I'm speaking into, or like this program that's turning my sound vibrations into binary code and back into vibrations. We're measuring these things all the time, and in many regards, our senses serve as a device of measurement and selection. And it's very possible that things that are playing out in infinitude get localized and they exit superposition and they enter into a position of localization with our perspective and our emotionalized thoughts. So to say that you are what you think you are is not just a refrigerator magnet or is not just some kind of pithy statement. It may capture a profound, profound glimpse of actual human experience that doesn't behave according to the ways that things are supposed to behave. But as we're seeing right now, neuroplasticity has shown us that brain matter doesn't behave the way it's supposed to behave. It's altered by thoughts. Quantum theory shows us that particles don't behave the way matter is supposed to behave. Serious psychical research shows us that the transfer of information doesn't behave according to the way information is supposed to be transferred among different sentient beings through the 5 senses. There's something else happening. So I think the same holds true with our experiences. And that's why perspective and the tantalizing possibility that we can actually select that perspective is so powerful and so determining.
But before we get to some techniques, specifically the chapter that you said is the most important chapter of your book, what are some advice about when to know, like you talk about, you've got to know these thoughts, you got to know what your desires are before you can even act upon them. And that's hard. We're programmed, we get delusional. You yourself give an example. You were a beat writer in Ohio and you were miserable. You had to follow some sinks to really pivot toward what your passion was, which was occult literature and publishing.
Right.
How do we know when these is the real thought? This is what I need to be doing. This is where I need to go with my life.
Yeah, it's wonderful and it's very heavy and it's fraught with danger and it's fraught with wonders, because one of the last tools that we think of is actually in the first place that we should be looking. And that is, what do I really, really want? Stripped of any embarrassment, stripped of any secondary considerations, stripped of any peer pressure, stripped of any so-called ethical thought that my head has been filled with, mostly through very distantly secondary sources. And most of all, stripped of the impression that I already know. You know, we walk around thinking we already know what we want. And that, I suspect, is the most limiting prejudice of all. We are creatures of habit. It's helpful in some ways. We repeat things to ourselves by habit all the time. We repeat things to ourselves by rote constantly. And I believe very strongly in a very, very deep attempt at self-verification of what we really want. And I challenge people, and I challenge myself in this area. You know, the other day I was talking to my shrink, and, you know, he asked me, what do I want? And I responded, and he said to me, well, that's superficial. And I said, well, wait a minute. You know me. I'm not a superficial person. I care very deeply. But if I come to a conclusion that you call superficial, in a certain sense, you've taken it from me. How do I know it's superficial? What is superficial anyway? You know, what is that? And people can have very, very deep-seated reasons, very meaningful reasons for certain things that they want. And as long as you're not doing violence to another person, by which I define as disrupting that other person's ability to pursue his or her own sense of highest potential, I don't see that you have to answer to anybody. And I think that asking yourself what you want, not just asking, but asking yourself with a sledgehammer, you know, just breaking away everything that's superfluous, everything that's kind of a limit or a yellow light or a red light, you know, based on what you've been told. I think that that is a vital must for entering into a sense of your own agency. All of these methods and exercises, you know, call them what you will, you know, prayer, visualization, affirmation, meditation, all of these things can be very, very powerful, but only if they have at the back of them this driving sense of purpose. It's so powerful, and it's so easy to overlook, because if you were to ask anybody, what do you want? You know, he or she would have a pithy answer at the ready. I would have a pithy answer at the ready, but it's not always true. It's not always true. You know, somebody who's spiritual, so-called, might discover that what they really want is money. Somebody who's a corporate go-getter might discover that what they really want is to be at home, you know, with the covers pulled over them. And in fact, that might be a great thing for that person, because it might really fit that person's nature. And that's so important. That's so vitally, vitally important. And yet I think we cheat ourselves and trick ourselves out of these insights, these potentially life-changing insights, because we believe in and stop at what we tell ourselves by rote, what we tell ourselves by habit, or even when we're within the confines of our own private thoughts, we are impacted by what we think will make us look good or bad in the eyes of others, or by what we think is ethical or unethical, right or wrong, superficial or deep, you know, depending upon what our preconceptions are. And I want the individual to feel deeply at liberty. And I often tell people, not only do you not have to share what you find with other people, I recommend not sharing it unless it's people you feel a profound sense of trust in, because others will take it from you. They will take it from you with their, you know, uninformed doubts and opinions and questions and the peer pressure and so on. So that exquisite privacy is a place where power comes from.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that's only half the battles. You're talking, it seems to me, self-knowledge, still the mind, so you can listen to yourself. Most of us don't do. At the same time, there is the plan of the divine. I think for me, one of the most famous stories, or the story that I relate to, is the story of Jonah. Mm-hmm. God keeps telling him, you need to do this, and he keeps not doing it. And no matter how many times God moves him here, moves him there, it's a classic story of not listening to, for lack of better words, your higher power. Mm-hmm. So it must be hard too, Mitch, because you have to listen to your desires to become complete, but you also have to listen to what your destiny might be, right? What your true path is. And you may not like this path. And you might end up in a Syrian refugee camp helping out or something like that.
Well, you're raising an interesting question. You know, there was a guy who came to one of my talks in Los Angeles, and he raised an objection that there is something else out there, whether it be a higher power or whatever you want to call it, that has an intention, a mission, a plan, a purpose. And Miguel, you know, at this point in my search, and I'm only speaking seeker to seeker, you know, this is really just a place that I'm coming from at this stage of my own search. I'm a lot less theistic in my thought system than I used to be. And I don't know if there's something out there that has an intention for me to which I have to defer. I'm on the side of the serpent in the garden. And I think that we are, in a sense, gods unto ourselves. And that it may be that what Jonah was running from was a sense of his own destiny from which he was turning away. So, you know, I'm on the serpent's side. And I think that there was a freedom in the biting of that apple that maybe freed the individual from a sense of deference while also bringing suffering, because I think the two are wed in a certain way. So I do have an ethic of nonviolence. I do believe there's cosmic reciprocity. And again, what I mean by nonviolence is not passivity, but not doing anything that would violate another's possibility to pursue his or her own higher sense of self, finest sense of self. But otherwise, I'm not sure that the individual in the paradigm of as above, so below owes something to a power outside him or herself.
Mm-hmm. You're on the side of the snake, man, the side of the Gnostics. Information and liberation is what you want at the end of the day. The truth will set you free. And are you an advocate? You believe in, you said what you put into the universe, you get out. Do you believe in reincarnation, or where are you at this stage of your?
Those are big questions for me. You know, there's a popular occult writer named Hans Holzer who made a very interesting observation about reincarnation, which always struck me as, you know, kind of being on the side of Occam's razor. And his observation was this. I really liked it. He said, look, we all have a feeling intrinsically that we enter life with a certain amount of pluses and minuses, with a certain temperament. We might have things that feel very intrinsically bound to our character, and we can spend our entire lives in therapy talking about these things, and yet there are certain traits that seem never to go away, that seem implacable, even in this deeply therapeutically driven culture of ours. And he said the single simplest argument on behalf of why that is so would be reincarnation, which a vast number of people, if not a majority of people in the world and in history, believe in and abide by. And he said it's the simplest answer that covers all the bases as to why we seem to enter life with such a decided temperament, and why no matter what we do, that temperament seems to remain intact. And certainly I have had the experience, and maybe you guys and other listeners have had the experience of, you know, I was in the delivery room when my kids were born, and I have observed them as beings who had an absolute temperament and character from the time they exited the womb. And it's very much like the character that they have today. And I'm sure the same is true of me and of all of us. And it is rather uncanny. I mean, of course, this all gets into the nature-nurture debate and so on, but it seems to almost go further than that. You know, people are really so marked by temperament and character, and it certain things can be sublimated, certain things can be emphasized, but the basic thumbprint of character is forever, no matter what you do. And you could view that as a trap, or, you know, Holzer felt that, you know, gee, here's one theory that seems to cover all the bases, and it's very simple, and that's reincarnation. So I've always been haunted by that. I'm undecided on the question, but I'm persuaded. I think he's got a really good handle on the logic of seizing upon a solution that's the simplest and the broadest. It's a very utilitarian answer.
Yeah, I would agree. I think my view of reincarnation has shifted throughout the years. It's just a matter of waiting for more downloading. These days, it's more I'm on the sort of Lurianic Kabbalah that we can go back for in time, and we actually have many sparks within us.
Yes.
And then a mixture of origin where we can reincarnate in different levels and
Yes.
different dimensions. So it's not,
Yes, I think
not
that's
the Western forward, blah, blah, blah. So, but
good.
again, like you, I'm still working on it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And to,
find out.
go ahead.
Even YouTube.
Huh?
We'll find out, at some point. I don't know how we'll share our data, but
We'll have to email each other from the other world.
Right. Or we'll be wrong, and the materialists will be right, and that's that,
And I'm sure that's got to be hard. I mean, in New York and so forth, and probably in Manhattan, the left wing is very, very secular. So I'm
Very
sure
much.
you can read. I mean, that's what Eric Davis was complaining. He writes a religious piece in Salon, and he gets roasted and destroyed because the New York left coast elite don't have no room, even from a anthropological, scholarly. They just have they can't handle New Age religion, ancient religion. So that must be a problem too that you get.
It's an absolute blind spot. It has something to do with, I think, a piece of misshapen progress that was taken by modernity. I mean, the whole point of the modernist perspective is that everything has underlying causes. So, for Louis Pasteur, it was germs and germ theory. For Sigmund Freud, it was traumas and forgotten or sublimated childhood pains. For Marx, it was economic struggle. For Einstein, it was the vagaries of energy, time and space. Everything has an underlying root cause, and if you can get at that underlying root cause, you can fix or repair things in the world that we want to improve. But excluded from that modernist viewpoint was the idea that an unseen cause could be the extra-physical. And almost as soon as Freud made the decision that ESP, or psychical research, would no longer be a part of his theoretical model because it was too fraught with potential pitfalls or complexities or problems or the wrong kind of occult patina that he didn't want to bring to his research, almost concurrent with that decision, modernity as a movement shunted out the idea of the spiritual. And that came from Marxism as well. Marx believed that the church was a tool of oppression, and the modernist viewpoint failed to account for any complexities of religion that really went beyond the Marxists to a very significant extent. So today, if you're part of the NPR crowd, you can kind of get down with a warmed over Buddhism, and it's nice that you can put electrodes to the Dalai Lama's head and prove that he's relaxing and that his respiratory state is deeper and more even. And you get to a certain age and you go through a divorce and you can rediscover Judaism, a very liberal variant, and somebody somewhere in the Christian world is doing, something good in connection with, treating HIV patients and things. But by and large, once you get beyond that very, very limited menu, the idea of religious conviction is considered delusory and anathema within the modernist mindset, and particularly within the culture that you're describing. This is why my first mainstream journalistic pieces were on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is known as being a conservative page. They were the ones who invited me in. I've since written for many other mainstream organs, but they were the first, and I never forget that. And things are friendlier and easier out west and in other parts of the country. But as you know, my favorite answer to the kind of left elite who look down their nose at religion or spirituality or the mystical or the occult comes from you, Miguel, which is you said, magic works whether you believe it or not. So you could scoff at it, you could do nothing, and complain all you want about Trump and call him a dark magician, but he only is adept at using the forces that you've neglected. So if you're not happy, use it. You don't have to believe it, and you're absolutely correct. So I always find myself quoting that.
And as you argue too, Trump is probably the master New Age, New Thought guy of our time.
Oh,
I mean, he believes it, he embraces it, and he probably uses it.
Yeah, he's so powerful. And if it's funny, just the other day, the Mueller report was released, and everybody who was hoping it would go like kabam, was disappointed. And I thought to myself, you could say colloquially, man, this guy leads a charmed life. This guy leads a charmed life. But there's something in that colloquialism that really, this capacity that he has to frame his own reality. It can sometimes be very frustrating and maddening, but it's enormously effective. And you and Michael Hughes and others have been pointing out that you're whistling past the graveyard if you think you can just neglect this and think that this as a force is just a figure of speech. And as you've pointed out, it works whether you believe it or not. So you can stand on the sidelines complaining, or you can make that part of your tool belt, if you feel like it. But the notion that individual perspective does invest tremendous power, including of an esoteric and occult sort, in the subject or the object who's wielding it, is, I think, a outmoded notion. It just doesn't cover all the bases of life anymore.
Yeah, I would agree. And of course, again, as we mentioned, that's, as you just said, that Trump is somebody who can make his myth, make his reality. He was Norman Vincent Peale. He went to his church. I mean, he really embraces New Thought, that if I think it will become reality. And
yeah. And again, you can kind of, throw rocks at the Google bus all you want, but the fact is that perspective on life is extremely powerful. It's extremely powerful because he didn't lose, and it shocked people, and it shocked me. And for all the things about him that are coarse and that are ugly, he did, in fact, as you point out, grew up in Norman Vincent Peale's congregation here in Manhattan, a few blocks from where I am right now, actually. And he talks about the influence of Peale, and Peale's book, Power of Positive Thinking, it's actually one of the very, very few childhood influences that Trump ever talks about. He talks about his father, and he talks about Peale. Those are pretty much the two influences that he speaks of. And when he does so, I would pay attention, because that's important information that's being disclosed.
yeah, I would agree. So let's talk about the most important chapter in your book, and that's one, How to Make a Miracle. We're talking about thoughts and making reality, myth making, magic, and all that. Tell us about this chapter and how it could really help others. Because I think at the end of the day, you wrote this book to understand New Thought reform, but you want to help everybody. That's what you want. People.
Well, I certainly want to
do well.
I want for my neighbor what I want for myself, which is the realization of one's fullest capacity and potential. It's what I wish for everybody watching this right now. It's what I wish for everybody who comes to my book. That chapter, How to Make a Miracle, it's funny, I say if you read only one chapter in this book or have only one takeaway, make it this one. And that is the chapter where I talk first and foremost about the importance of having an absolute, passionately felt, even obsessively felt aim, and how vitally important that is, and that it must be something that is exquisitely honest and truthful. And it requires a very, very blunt form of self-honesty, and a private self-honesty, because I think there are certain places the individual must go by him or her self alone. There are places we have to journey alone. And asking yourself, what do I really want from life? What do I really want from life is a place that you must ultimately venture to alone. And it's good to venture there alone, because it can be fearsome and it can be embarrassing, and you don't want the influence of other people taking from you what you find there. And once you find what you really want, and you will find it if you truly seek that, I do believe there's no barrier that can keep you from it. You will find the answer to that query. And once you have located that answer, then you need to focus your mind upon it in a way that brooks no compromise, no compromise. And I'm a very deep advocate of getting very, very clear in writing, physical writing, not on a computer, but physical writing, so that you have a tactile, actualized document that states what you want. And then there are all kinds of methods and ideas, and I go through many of them in the book, that you can use to help promote that, using visualizations or affirmations when you're in the hypnagogic state, different types of experimental or radical prayer, in embracing of different values and principles that will direct you towards a life that is more driven by ideals than by peer pressure. And there's many, many different possibilities and modalities and techniques. And I walk through a lot of them in the book, but it's the arrival at that self-honest sense of impassioned purpose, whatever it is, and the bravery to come to that, to write it down, and to make a pact with yourself that you will see that as central to your life, regardless of the other demands that life throws on you, regardless of how contradictory it may seem to other roles that you are called to fill. That will bring the miraculous to your life. And by a miracle, I simply mean something that, a fortuitous event that surpasses all expectation and circumstance. A truly fortuitous, dramatic unfolding that surpasses all reasonable expectation. It's that simple. We shouldn't be afraid of the word. It shouldn't be used lightly, but nor should it be shunted as something that's either new age hype or something that can only belong to the scriptural past. I reject that. It is definable, and it is possible to pursue that in your life, which would be a dramatic exception to all reasonable circumstance and expectation. That's what I define as the miraculous. And it is possible in the life of the individual.
Beautifully said. And again, for the audience, he has the breakdown, everything. I think I'm thinking of what they say in hang on until the miracle happens. And you give the example of Bill W. met
Yes.
Evie Thatcher.
Yeah.
And Evie was sober, and that, Evie told him about find your own power, your own God. Bill became sober, but then I didn't know this, like I told you in an email, Evie went back out and had a pretty hard life. And you say the difference was Bill wanted that sobriety with all of his soul, not his mind, it was his soul. This was what drove him, and he became one of the most influential people of the 20th century.
Yes, for real. And Bill's wife, Lois, wondered, why did Ebby relapse constantly throughout his life into drunkenness? And she thought perhaps Ebby wanted to get sober just to stay out of trouble. But for Bill, as you were just alluding, it became this absolute center of gravity in his life. And Bill did succeed. And before one concludes that a personal goal is necessarily single-minded, Bill also discovered that maintaining sobriety was a matter of fellowship, that to maintain his own sobriety, he had to help other people maintain their sobriety. So it didn't become two separate goals. He just discovered within his goal, it so happened that there was a fellowship component. So I often tell people that I'm sensitive to the fact that we all have different demands on us in life, and there are demands that come at us from seemingly different directions, to be a parent, to be a worker, to be a caregiver, to maybe older parents or what have you. And those things are all serious. So one well-selected goal can cover a lot of different bases, But at the end of the day, I have to be frank, it might not cover all the bases. It might not. And I do believe that life strikes a tough bargain with us, which is that if you can select something that you absolutely want with all your being, you will get it, or you will get something very close to it. But it may not cover every base in life. There's something about a concentration of energies that is a natural law. We see this in the surrounding world. I think it's true in our own psyches. And if you look at people that you really admire in life, people you regard as heroes or role models, you'll almost always find that they existed for one thing. There was one exquisite thing that was at the center of their lives. And they weren't always perhaps the greatest or the most accomplished people in other areas of their lives. But they did accomplish that thing which shone a light for other people, which may be shining a light for you right now. It's a tough bargain. And I would say select a goal wisely, and it may cover a lot of bases. It certainly did for Bill. But there may also be bases that it doesn't cover. And I think that one has to look that in the eye in a very steely way.
Mm. Well said again. It reminds me of Joseph Campbell when he said, follow your bliss and doors will open. My problem is always I was always fighting my bliss. It was just too good. But
many of us are, man. Yeah, many of us are. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Nate, do you have a question for Mitch? I know you got some syncs or something personal you want to share with him as we get towards the end of the interview.
Well, actually, I just went through something right now that maybe I'll share with you two at a later time and date that was matching up with everything that Mitch was just saying. But yeah, I mean, my mom and I have been watching The Monkees recently.
All right.
And I was, yeah, it's like,
the book. You'll have to read the book, but the Monkees are part of this.
Yes, they are.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that, you know, a lot of us find that our lives become very synchronistic and synchro generators. But I can't look at my notes right now, but I was really struck by something you said about becoming a vessel for the higher principles of life, and how that can make you someone who kind of spirals out, taking care of your own self first so that you're able to take care of others. I really wish I could look at my notes right now. I have pages of them, but that's what I got right now. And yeah, I did your miracle. I did your miracle club today at 3. I just found out, like my dentist, he had to cancel tomorrow because he wasn't specific, but basically I prayed for him at 3. I prayed for the completion of the book that I'm working on, which I know you got the feels when it comes to books. And yeah, so I did your miracle club today, and I got a lot of things with your book. I was reading, you know, your book on March 23rd when it said March 23rd. So, you know, it just, yeah. So I guess that's what I got. I don't really have too many other questions right now. I just want to thank you for what you've done. This book, I can tell you, has very profoundly touched me, and I look forward to reading it again so that I can build some of its own principles into the book that I'm working on. That's what I got to say.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what did you talk about, the miracle thing? Is that the thing where you pray at 3 p.m., the collective praying?
Yes, I pray at 3 p.m. Eastern time. I invite everybody to join me. I set an alarm on my phone to do it. And I certainly pray for the intentions of anybody who joins in with me. And it's a way for us just to take a few moments out of the day, wherever we are, wherever we live, and just spend a few moments in fellowship, holding wishes for one another's ethical desires.
Awesome. Yeah, and I didn't know this too, but yeah, you were behind Richard Smoley's The Deal. It's a very underrated book that I wish had done much better, because, I mean, obviously, Richard is a great scholar. He's obviously written, you know, Secret History, Inner Christian, Friend of the Gnostics, and it's a great book. We should plug it. Please plug it.
The Deal is a truly wonderful book. And it's funny, you're literally the second person. It's not a well-known book. And you're the second person within, I think, 48 or 72 hours who's told me how deeply they like and appreciate that book. Richard Smoley, great esoteric intellect, wrote a short, very powerful book, which I published, called The Deal. And it's basically an exercise in which you strive to forgive everyone in your life, which Richard sees as the one kind of escape hatch we get from our own karma. As we give, so we receive. And since we're all in need of forgiveness, obviously, he uses this exercise to help in a bodily, emotional, and psychical way to forgive everyone in your life. And the whole thing can really be done during an extended lunch hour, as long as you have a private place to retire to. And it's my favorite kind of philosophical exercise because it's very practical, it's very available, and you know that a figure like Richard Smalley is writing from the deepest intellectual and ethical intent. And the book is called The Deal, and you owe it to yourself to check it out. You won't forget it. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, as a bonus for this audio, I'm going to put our interview I did with Richard with The Deal. I just decided right now, and you guys will see Mitch's fingerprints all over it. But again, very underrated book. I think it should have been done better.
I couldn't agree more. I was perplexed. I thought to myself, this book has everything that is needed to break out to a mass audience, but you just can't predict these things. Right. And yet it's such a pleasure. It's such a magnificent, wonderful book. You'll come away from it changed, at least in your perspective, and the exercise can be extremely powerful.
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of scholarship, metaphysics. Again, good Richard Smalley covers all the bases, inspirational. So good job. And to end, Mitch, maybe a little advice for the audiences. You were talking about the whole Russian collusion, and of course, I think it's all controlled opposition. That's neither here nor there. But you've got, one side with Schadenfreude, another side suffering. We know within 6 months it's going to change.
It's going to change, yeah.
But everybody is in a state of tension. Everything is politicized. I like you on social media. You're always very measured. I've never seen you get offended once. You might be one of the few people on Twitter who's never been offended. You just sort of give your opinion and you walk away and all that. What advice do you have for people who are literally killing themselves, dying of stress over the politics and the stress of social media?
Well, man, that's a wonderful question. I think that we have to be very, very careful not to confuse or conflate taking a stand on social media with actual living. Every time somebody scolds me for something on social media, I honestly ask myself, would your boyfriend or girlfriend or whomever is in your life say, like, you are always there for me. You are always really on point, helping me with shit. When you say you're going to help me move, man, you show up with coffee that morning to help me. We rarely ask ourselves what role we play, how we function in the lives of other people. And Twitter and, all the various social media, it just distances us from that. I'm not saying not to care about politics, not to have a point of view, and to see through your point of view, in the world as best you can. But it's just not real when you're hanging out on Twitter, throwing rocks at people. And you got to be really careful with that, because when you're throwing rocks at people, it solidifies this kind of delusory point of view that the bad guy is always out there. He's always somewhere else. And we don't ask ourselves, how do other people experience me? Do they hate me? Do they resent me? Am I reliable? Because if you can't keep your word and you can't be reliable as a baseline, you can't do anything. You cannot do anything. So I think that the thrill and the kind of adrenalized Schadenfreude and kind of the, how shall I put it, sort of this disinhibited verbal violence that we engage in on Twitter makes us strangers to ourselves, and makes it all the harder to be happy, because you will not be knowing yourself and what you want, because you're so busy being moral in this make-believe way towards other people. So work for what you want in the world. I'm not counseling passivity or disengagement by any means, but never confuse that with social media.
Yeah. And I think you would agree with me. Maybe we're just an older generation, Gen X's, but my politics does not define me or you. I could care less whether Mitch Horowitz votes for Trump or Tulsi Gabbard or Joe Biden. It doesn't matter. It's just what you do. You came to a decision at a time in your life, and that's on the road you are, and that's neither here nor there.
I agree. And, I think it's very important to remember when you're dealing with people that you might be talking to somebody who would literally run into a burning building to help you, who might vote differently from you. And you'll never know that. You'll never know that because the relationship just falls apart so quickly. And I also realize as I get older that most of what we refer to as our political positions are really just our wish to see the establishment of a world in which I feel safe. So different people come to the table with these different political points of view, and it gets emotional very quickly. And the reason it gets emotional so quickly, I believe, is because we feel our safety is at risk. I'm not always sure that that's true, but I do believe that our political opinions get shaped based on what we feel is the kind of world that we personally will be safe in. And then we project that outwards and think, no, it's the only rational way to go, and so on. Sometimes it may be the rational way to go, but the reason it gets so emotional is because it grows first from the emotions.
Well said, and good sage advice. So as we end, tell the audience where they can find out more about you. Where do they go to get more about Mitch?
I'm online. My website is mitchhorowitz.com. I have lots of lectures you can find on YouTube. I'm writing a lot of new articles at medium.com. Some of what we've talked about tonight, I extrapolate on or expand on, or there are new directions or second thoughts that I articulate in articles at Medium, among other places. My books are on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the various indie sites, you name it. Lots of audiobooks as well. And you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook and keep up a lot of this stuff too. Just,
Don't argue with them about
may or may not find political arguments there, but you'll find lots of other stuff.
There you go. The real stuff, the real reality, if you would. So, all right. Well, we are coming to the end. I'd like to thank the audience, those of you in the chat room who have joined us. Again, this will be out in a few days this week. It will be out on audio on all our channels. It will be on YouTube. So please check it out. Check out Mitch's book, The Miracle Club. It's a great read, well worth your time. Nate, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you guys so much. And Mitch, great work. And thank you. And Miguel, thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for being here. Well, Mitch, as always, it's great talking to you And when you come to Chicago in July, we need to get together and
definitely count on it
and talk about anything but politics.
Right. Thanks, man.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for being here. We will talk soon.
Good night. Bye.
Bye. All right. We're up. Are we still live?
Yeah. Oh, we're live.